Hello, welcome to my demonstration on MariaDB SkySQL, a new database as a service offering offered by MariaDB. Today, we're going to take a look at what it looks like to actually jump into the MariaDB SkySQL portal and how we can create a database instance, how we can configure that database instance, and the different options that are available to you within the portal itself. And then we're going to actually, after we've created an instance, we're going to take a look at how you can both connect to MariaDB SkySQL and then be able to manage the database and use the database that exists up in the cloud. So let's start first by going to cloud.mariadb.com/SkySQL. And that's going to bring you to a screen, once you've logged in with your MariaDB ID, to a page that has a title of Launch a Service. Now, if you're not familiar with what a database as a service is, you can simply think of it as an abstraction. It is allowing you to work with the database without having to worry about things like provisioning a machine or installing a database and updating a database, having to work with all the minutia that's involved with working with the database. You simply let the as a service part really take that over. And once you go into this screen, you'll see that we've got a couple of different options here, right? We've got transactions, analytics, both, which has got this HTAP word inside of it and something called scale out transactions. These are the service offerings that are available within MariaDB. And we're going to go ahead and start by taking a look at the left-hand side of something called transactions. Now, you're likely familiar with what transactional databases are, right? You can think of it as your typical row-based, really relational SQL-based databases that have existed for decades. And these really take information and they store them in a way that houses them on persistent storage blocks in the cloud service itself. And these work really well for applications up to a certain point, right? Where you have a certain amount of data. But as data has grown and grown with different types of applications, there's been this necessity to have different kinds of storage mechanisms which allow you to be able to run calculations on large data sets or run queries on large data sets without having to create so many performance enhancing indexes or really have to just give the database your full attention all the time. And that takes us to the second option here where we see analytics. Analytics is a columnar-based service. And it is a columnar-based storage engine that allows you to access large amounts of information, which are stored on object storage in the cloud, which really just equates to being able to store a dynamically really large amount of data for a lot less money, essentially, than persistent disk. But what analytics really lets you do is take a look at queries using the structured or SQL, the structured query language, and be able to run those queries directly or in an ad hoc fashion against that data without having to create a ton of indexes to improve performance. And on the right-hand side, where we have both, we really are just combining both the transactional or row-based information with the analytical or column-based information that you see on that left-hand side. And this is known as HTAP, or Hybrid Transactional Analytical Processing, which is kind of a mouthful, but essentially it's saying it's the hybrid between the transactions and the analytics, which I just spoke about. And we're actually going to use that for our example as we dive more into the code itself. But before we do that, the last thing that I want to talk to you about is the option on the bottom here, which is in Tech Preview. And it's known as scale out transactions. And underneath the hood, it uses a new product from MariaDB called Expand. And that it just allows you to use distributed SQL, right? Where you're actually distributing the information within your database over a variety of nodes. And underneath the hood, it uses a concept called slices to be able to put those different pieces of information in a strategic way to allow you to access it both quickly and in a scalable fashion. Now, I'm not going to dive into the intricacies of scale-out transactions, but I highly encourage you, if you're interested, to go to MariaDB.com and check out the documentation for scale-out transactions. Instead, we're going to jump directly into what it looks like to launch a service. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to click Launch underneath the Both block on the right-hand side. And once I bring that up, you'll see at the very top of the screen, we are given a title of MariaDB Platform for Smart Transactions. And what Smart Transactions means is it is essentially being able to combine row-based and column-based information, or transactional and analytical information, for smarter transactions, right? Using a single query or a single SQL command, or linked commands, to be able to take advantage of both transactional and large amounts of analytical information. As you scroll down, you can see that now we're getting into how we can set up our instance, specifically where we're going to set up our instance. And so you have the ability to choose where the server, which is going to house your MariaDB SkySQL instance, lives. I currently am located in Chicago, so I'm just going to go ahead and go with the default of US Central. But we have a variety of options from the US, Asia, and Europe that you can choose from. And we're going to be adding more and more as time goes on. As you keep scrolling, you can see that you have the ability to choose the resources or the instance sizes for the machine that you want to use for your MariaDB SkySQL instances. And the way that this is described is we have broken this down into CPUs, or as you can see, vCPUs for virtual CPUs, and memory. And it goes everything from 4 virtual cores, or 4 virtual CPUs and 15 gigs of memory, all the way to 64 by 416, so pretty large. And on the right-hand side, you can see how the prices, of course, will ramp up depending on the types of resources that you're using. Continuing to scroll down, you can see that you have the ability to set a transactional storage amount. Now, by default, this is going to be 100 gigs, which is more than enough for our demonstration. But note that if you click the drop-down, you have everything from 100 gigs all the way up to 6 terabytes. And if you need more information, please feel free to reach out to us, and we can certainly make that happen if you need more than 6 terabytes, which is a ton of information, but you just never know. Next, you have the ability to choose the server version. And this comes into play specifically because we're looking at an HTAP instance where we're using both the transactional information and we're using the columnar or column storage engine that I mentioned before. And so you have the ability to choose the version of that. Next, you can just simply provide a name. So I can give it something simple like HTAP-demo. Gives you a little bit of a pricing information and the ability then to launch the service. And that's really it. You've gone within a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds. I'm probably slower at this, but a couple of seconds, and then you can just launch the service. Now, to save a little bit of time here, I'm just going to go ahead and look at some services that I've already created because it takes about a minute to go ahead and do that. So we're going to go ahead and save some time for the back end of this demo by checking out some of the services that I've already created. And I can do that by clicking on the left-hand side of your services. I'm going to leave this information I've created. And once that page loads up, you can see that all the services I've created are listed here. Now, all the information inside of this table should seem very familiar. It's information, most of it is information we just saw in the last screen, with the exception of you are given some statuses of the service itself, right? Whether it's up, down, and the state that it's running in. And I'm going to click on the top row here, which is HTAP-demo, which is our HTAP instance that we're going to be using for this sample. In there, you can see that I've got the information that was included inside of that row, just kind of put in a different fashion, right? Everything from the name, the status, the version. But what we also see is on the right-hand side, we can see a read-write port. Now, combined with the fully qualified domain name right underneath here, that's the information that we need to actually physically know where the SkySQL service instance is. And that kind of gets us halfway there of how we're able to connect to MariaDB SkySQL. Next, as we continue down this list, we can see that we have the ability to set custom configuration. And if you're not familiar with MariaDB, know that MariaDB offers a large variety of system variables and configurable information that you can use to tune the database to your needs. And so we wanted to be able to allow this as something that you can access within MariaDB SkySQL as well. And you can either access it by clicking the link next to custom configuration, manage custom configurations, or you can go back to this left-hand navigation and you can click configuration manager. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the configuration manager just to give you a feeling of what this looks like and what's involved in actually setting up your configuration. Now, looking at this list, you can see that there are several different options here, but the thing to note here is that out of the box, you're going to be given some default configuration. So depending on your instance, transactional, columnar, or analytics, and HTAP, you're going to have different configuration defaults and different configuration default lists. From there, you can actually create your own by either going to create new configuration, or you can simply create or click on an existing configuration and then just choose to clone that configuration. You can rename it, you can edit it, and create your own configurations. So if we go and take a look at the top one on the list here, which is Rob's super config, I can see that I have a configuration. It has mostly default values, and it's in its second version as indicated at the top here. If, for instance, I wanted to take a look, we can see at the bottom, I actually have saved a different value, which has justified the creation of this configuration option. I can take a look at the right-hand side in the actions dropdown, and I can say, okay, I want to edit the configuration. And this is then going to convert it to more of a write screen, right? Where I can actually, through a series of dropdowns, change the values that exist within my configuration. So I'm just going to scroll back down here to the bottom, and I'm going to bump up my timeout because I write extremely bad queries. So instead of fixing those queries, I'm just going to go ahead and bump up the values because why not, right? And I can save that. Once I save that value, we can see that I have a new version of this configuration. And I can see that by going into my service, clicking back into my HTAP-demo, and I can see that I have set Rob's super config v2, but it's giving me a note or an indication here that there is a newer version, the version that I just saved. So if I want to update the version, I can simply click on this right gear or this gear icon on the right-hand side, and I can check out the modal and I can look at Rob's super config. And what that's going to do is it's going to update it to the latest version, which exists as v3. And now I have this super resilient or extremely large timeout, which is going to allow me to keep writing really bad queries. Last on this page, I have this portion called Whitelisted IP Addresses. And this exists because by default, nothing can access SkySQL until the client is given whitelist or is whitelisted in a way that it can actually access it. So you're going to need to provide either an IP address or a range of IP addresses in order to be able to access SkySQL. And I've gone ahead and put in my IP address so that we can just save a little bit of time and jump right into it. After we've done this, we can check out this top portion here and we can see that we've got a couple of buttons. On the left-hand side, which we're going to look at here shortly, is Show Credentials, which is going to give us the rest of the information that we need to actually connect to SkySQL. Then you have the ability to stop the service. So if for any reason you really wanted to pause or stop that service, you could. And then, of course, you have the ability to just completely delete that service instance. But let's go ahead and take a look at Show Credentials. If we load this modal, we'll see that on top of some of the information that I've already indicated that we need, such as the qualified domain name and the port number to know exactly where the service instance is, we also need things like the username and the password to be able to authenticate ourselves and actually connect to the service instance. Beyond that, we actually enforce encrypted communication through something called a certificate authority chain. So you can download what is a PIM file or a SIR file, depending on your operating system, and then you can use that within your command to be able to tell the server from the client that it has the ability to access that database service instance. So we're going to start by downloading the certificate authority chain, which is going to put it in our default downloads folder. Then I'm going to cruise through this list, which tells me, of course, I need to add my whitelist IP address, which I did. It gives me some sample CLI or command line interface that I can use to actually connect to MariaDB SkySQL using the MariaDb client, which is available at MariaDB.com. So if you want to download the client, it takes a couple of seconds. You'll have it on your machine, and then you can connect to it very simply. And then lastly, of course, because you certainly don't want to keep this default value, we've given the SQL that you would need just to quickly be able to change that password. Now, for our sample, I'm just going to be using the default password instead of setting a new one, just because nothing I do here is going to be that important or groundbreaking, because as you saw, I had to bump up my query timeouts anyway. So the queries that I'm going to be writing aren't that important. But let's start by, of course, copying the CLI here. And then I want to load a terminal window. And I'm just going to paste in my command. And this command, again, uses the MariaDB client. It provides the qualified domain. It supplies the port number, the username, the password, and then the information for connecting via SSL. So as I mentioned before, I downloaded the SkySQL_chain.pim file to my downloads folder. So I'm just going to keep this in as the default because that's where it exists. Now, before I can run this, I need to copy my password because it's going to prompt me for that. And we'll see that that's all it takes to be able to connect to MariaDB SkySQL. So now I'm in to MariaDB SkySQL, and I can confirm this by running a very simple command of show databases. And from there, I can see that I have a variety of default databases, and I can even go as far as to say create a database as, we'll say, Rob's demo DB. Oops. Give it a semicolon, because that's very important. And then if we run that command again, we can confirm that now that we're not only connected to MariaDB SkySQL, but we've actually been able to run some SQL and work with the database itself. But, you know, that's not very exciting because we know, of course, that databases are pretty simple, connecting, working with them in SQL. What we really want to dive into and what makes MariaDB so unique, and specifically MariaDB SkySQL, is this ability to use different types of storage engines. Specifically, we want to look at something called Inodb, which is our transactional or row-based information, alongside column store, which is our columnar information, which has us look at just a large amount of information from an analytical perspective. To do that, I am going to exit. And I'm actually just going to close my terminal window because I want to check out a repository that I'm going to be using to actually show how we can connect to, of course, MariaDB SkySQL, which we've been doing, but then be able to create schemas for both Inodb, or that transactional side, and columnar on that column store side. And I've created a completely open source, completely public repository, which is just includes the steps that I'm going to be using within this demonstration, that's available at github.com/MariaDB-corporation/dev example SkySQL HTAP quick start. So kind of a mouthful there, but it's available at MariaDB-corporation GitHub account. And we've got a variety of different demonstrations available at developer-examples as well. But here, I'm going to be checking out specifically this URL, and I want to copy that to my clipboard because I want to actually clone down this repository because I'm going to be using the scripts inside of it to fast track us into looking at both transactional and analytical information side by side. So once I've done that, I'm going to minimize my screen, and I'm going to open up a browser or a folder window here where I can check out a folder that I want to pull this repository into. So Big Data Toronto, and I want to actually use a git clone, and then I'm just pasting in the git address for that information, and I'm cloning down that repository. Once I've done that, I want to take a look, and I can see that I have brought down that mouthful of a folder name. So I'm going to paste a command to actually step into that so I don't fat finger anything with cd dev example SkySQL HTAP quick start. Once I'm inside of that folder, then I'm going to do an ls to basically show what we have in there. Now, we have, of course, the license from GitHub, the README that we were looking at on the web page. but also we'll see that we have a create and load shell script. Now, to show off this shell script, I'm going to open up a new window of something called Visual Studio Code, which is simply a code editor, an open source code editor, which is going to allow me to take just an easier look at the repository and the contents within inside of it. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that I have a solution window, which contains all the same content that you just saw within the terminal window, but in a little bit more readable of a fashion. And we're going to specifically start by taking a look at the create _and _load shell script. And this shell script is doing a couple of things for us. One, it's connecting to MariaDB just like we did before. So it's allowing us to take in the qualified domain name, the port number, the credentials, and connect to MariaDB SkySQL. From there, I have compiled a couple of scripts together in order to be able to create the schemas for MariaDB SkySQL in the Inodb side and also the columnar side. So I'm going to be creating both of those two databases. And that happens from a file called schema.sql. Inside of schema.sql, and actually, we need to take a look at this sample. So this one, let's go ahead and take a look at the sample that I pulled out. I actually, looks like I pulled down the wrong sample. So let's go ahead and check. This is the right one. Let's go ahead and check really quick the one that I pulled down. So if we check a look at, okay, so it looks like I actually opened the wrong one inside of my code editor. So let's go ahead and open a new window, and I'm going to physically go to the one that I actually just brought down. I knew that didn't look familiar. So let's go here, and I'm going to open up the quick start guide to the repository that I actually pulled down. Now, again, very similar, but the schema files are slightly different. So again, we go into our create and load script. Now, the process is exactly the same as I described before. We're actually using the connection to MariaDB SkySQL that we establish, and then we're running a set of SQL scripts, as well as some load data local in files off of some CSVs to import the information into our database tables. So let's go ahead and take a look. First, we're going to create a travel database, which contains 3 tables: airlines, airports, and flights. And those are all Inodb tables. From there, we're going to create a travel history database. And this is a separate database that's going to contain our column store table, which is called flights. Now, inside of this shell script, once I've created those schemas, I'm going to put information into each of those tables. I'm going to put a collection of airports and airlines into the Inodb tables, and then I'm going to put almost 700,000 records of flight information into the flights table. And this is going to allow us then to, of course, be able to query those independently. But because we're using an HTAP instance, we're actually going to combine both the row-based and column-based information into a single query. So let's go ahead and start by executing our shell script. Now, I'm going to paste in a command for that shell script, which executes the script itself and then provides the information for the qualified domain name, the port number, username, and password. But before I can do this, I actually need to pull in that SkySQL chain authority file. So I actually need to pull in the certificate file that tells the server that the client can access it. Once I've done that, from a relative perspective, now I can execute this script to both create the schema and then load all of the subsequent information on both the Inodb and the column store side. And as you can see, it's already completed. So now I'm just going to paste in that information again to connect to MariaDB SkySQL. So I've pasted in the command to use the client to connect and then the password. From there, I want to show databases, and I can see that now I have a travel and travel history database which contains those tables. And if I want to confirm, I can take a look at travel.airlines, and I can see that I have 30 records. On the other side, I can see that I have nearly 700,000 records at travel history.flights. From there, really what I want to do is I actually want to combine information and into a single query, being able to use both the Inodb and the column store side through something called a cross-engine query. So as I mentioned before, these are different storage engines, and we're just using a cross-engine query to combine them into a single SQL statement. Now, to avoid fat fingering anything, I'm going to paste this SQL command in, but I'll explain it before we execute it. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to select airline from the Inodb side, and we're wanting to say for every airline, what's the average departure delay of all the flights that exist for this airline or for the different airlines. And we're going to do that by being able to join the travel.airlines table to the travel history.flights table. So joining an Inodb table directly to a column store table. We're going to group by airline so that we can get the name of the airline, and then we're going to order by our average departure delay. Execute the script, and I can, or the command, and I can see that within a matter of just under a quarter of a second on about 700,000 records, without creating any indexes, we've been able to calculate the average departure delay for all of the airlines inside of the airline table, which exists on the Inodb side. And that's it. That's all it takes to be able to not only get into MariaDB SkySQL, create a service instance to however you'd want to be able to use it, take the configuration and credentials, put those into a client or some kind of code connector, and then be able to execute queries, all within a matter of minutes. And I highly recommend that if you have any questions or you want any more information, please visit mariadb.com or MariaDB-Corporation GitHub account for all kinds of different samples and demonstrations that you yourself can have up and running in a matter of minutes. Thank you very much for watching this demonstration. I hope you have a great time at the rest of the conference.